Do you want to wait for Arthur? Should I start?
Start, I invite him in when he's online.
Okay, so I was in shul this morning. I went to shul for Shacharit and I went to the earlier minyan. Then I wanted to learn. So I went to the later minyan. And obviously there are certain things were happening there that I had to respond to. So yeah, I've done some research and it says if someone goes to an earlier minyan and has to get something for whatever reason or has to do something at another shul, where the minion started later, you have to, there's certain responses that you have to respond to, even though you did it in the previous minion. And those include Kaddish, you have to answer Amen, Yehei Shemei Rabbah, and you also have to answer Baruch Hu. You participate in the whole Kedusha. You say Modim de Rabbanan, and you answer Amen to the brachot. So what it says here, even though you filled your personal obligation, at an earlier minion, um, and you come to another minion, you're considered part of the the kehillah, the communal prayers. So you need to show kavod for as being part of the kehillah, even though you said it before. So it's just common decency and respect. And in terms of a Torah reading, if it was, let's say, a Monday or a Thursday that someone did this, um, there's some poskim say that you should stay there and listen to the Torah reading. And if you are about to leave, you wait till either the uh, Kohen, Levi, Israel reading is finished, and then you can leave. You can leave in between as long as the Torah is closed, as we discussed a few weeks ago. So um, then that's basically what it's all about.
Okay. Um,
Okay.
all right. Let's get started. Um, Bottom line, we went into what constitutes um, going to exile in terms of the Torah derivative. Is that we said in about Midbar chapter 35, verse 22, that if it's a term of suddenly, okay. In that particular case, as opposed to ambush, ambush obviously is premeditation. You don't get the city of refuge for that. If it was suddenly, you are eligible as far as that's concerned. And it said, except in a case where you've got a fellow walking in Hillbrow with a knife to protect himself. And as Aidan quite correctly pointed out, obviously, if he's pointing it horizontally where he can shish above somebody and walking at a hell of a pace, he's liable. That certainly isn't exempt. And the reason why it'd be liable in that case is it wouldn't be that it'd be liable exile, it would be liable bordering on the deliberate. Because that's not a minor degree of negligence. That is gross negligence. And we said in that particular case, not every opinion is the same because there's two approaches. The Ritva says that the victim entered the intersection before the killer reached it. In other words, he's going at a hell of a pace and he's just turning the corner. Now, even if there wasn't a person with a knife, it could be with somebody having a glass plate, moving it, and he'd walk straight into it. He could walk into a pothole. So the thing of it is, you have to walk with a certain degree of intelligence, and therefore that would be almost um, a complete accident, Karav honest, right? Now, they don't all feel that way because the Meiri turns around and said, look, anybody walking with a knife is almost bordering on deliberate, which is a Karav Lemazid, which means he doesn't go to exile because it's bordering on gross negligence. Whereas, as far as the writ is concerned, it's almost a complete accident, and therefore he doesn't deserve to be punished by going to exile. And as far as uh, the Rambam is concerned, he actually holds very much with the Meiri as far as this is concerned. Now, just again, there was this case of there you also excluded from the city of exile if there is almost a motive base. So what would be a motive? Is that if somebody conveniently died and you were in a financial predicament, but you stood to inherit millions of dollars, in that particular case, it's rather convenient that you dropped a tree log on the head from the roof. So, in that particular case, that's bordering on the deliberate, and therefore that person wouldn't have the protection of the Goel Adam from the Goel Adam, nor would they be able to get an atonement on that basis. The classical Gemara example in terms of motive is if you accidentally kill an enemy, even advertently. What's considered an enemy, it doesn't necessarily mean it's like the Montagues and the Capulets from Romeo and Juliet, where there's like a interfamily feud for decades. It could be as much as the town has heard that you were the best of mates and suddenly you had a bit of a lash out and you guys really blew off at each other, or you're not on speaking terms for the last couple of days and you're waiting to cool off. Anything that is public knowledge in that regard is seen as enmity, which means that person's your enemy, even if they're newly your enemy, and therefore any accident that happens, which would be inverted comma inadvertently, is obviously has a motive there. The typical case where you could be exiled would be if you're in a nightclub and you're dancing and you smash somebody with your body. Now, it's not a complete accident because you should have been very much aware that you could injure somebody else, and it's not bordering on deliberate because you were okay, you might have been a little bit drunk and excited, etc., but you don't want to have your life turned upside down, nor do you want somebody else to lose their life. So that would be the classical case. But we are saying what happens about the eligibility of exile uh, if you killed in a downward motion, but it was there to facilitate an upward motion. In other words, you're bending down to lift something up. So we're saying, how do you actually work it out? So we judge each motion by the actual direction and not by its ultimate purpose. So if your body is going down in order to go up, at the point where you go down and you create the damage, that's indeed where you're liable. It's not the ultimate purpose, it's what's actually going on at that point in time. So a downward motion is always preparatory to an upward one, and yet it makes the killer liable for exile. Okay? So just one last case that we dealt with yesterday, and that was this case of a projectile. Now it could be a projectile that you throwing a knife, or it could be alternatively that you are in fact um, just pitching a cricket ball, which is rather hard. We're not really supposed talking about a gun in that sort of technology time, because one of the other problems with a gun, guys, would be what? What would one of the other problems with a gun be? We discussed it yesterday. Guys, pulses, anything?
I was with Lance yesterday.
Oh, okay. Um,
No, I was actually quite focused, but I actually don't remember that at
so
all. I
we're
lost.
using this example when my martial arts instructor told me many years ago, always keep like a Phillips screwdriver in the back of your pocket because then you can say, listen, you unfortunately got in an altercation and this person was going to cause you bodily damage and you stabbed him in the esophagus because you feared for your life. But if you have a switchblade, nobody can argue in court that that was meant to peel tomatoes. And therefore, from a legal standpoint, you should have a weapon that looks like it has another utility. He suggested a star screwdriver simply because if you puncture somebody, in fact, my grandfather gave me a bayonet once, and it has this thin slit so that when you push through somebody's lungs, you can't get past a certain point if there's a vacuum lock. You have to have the air escape. I don't know what he used it for, but and he was old, but I didn't think like Napoleon bayonet sort of old. I mean, basically they had guns, but they had bayonets for close contact killing. So just the bottom line we're saying is that the minute there's a gun, you're intending to do harm, and then we go more according to the rubber opinion of culpability. Here we're saying a guy's just playing cricket. That's not a deadly weapon. He happens to have created a deadly result. And therefore, what happened was we say that it's deemed a complete accident if he was meant to throw to the left and he threw to the left, to the right, and somebody was killed. Okay. Now, as far as that's concerned, they also don't all share the same opinion because the Ritva says that, look, if a person kills as a result of throwing and he misses his mark, whether he misses in the wrong direction or overthrows his mark and kills, the Ritva is saying in this particular case, either way is exempt. But the Ritva, don't forget, was the same one that said that the victim should have been more careful. So he's seeming to let off the person that's actually caused the damage by extenuating circumstances. Again, the Meiri is holding that anything that you throw out of your hand, like a cricket ball, if somebody isn't wearing proper cricket helmet and pads and is on the field, and you're in a dangerous place, anybody that's killed is your responsibility because you can't particularly know if you're a good thrower or not, nor if you're going to hit the person with such velocity that you're going to create frontal temporal lobe brain damage. Okay? So it's not merely a conceptual differences. We could say it's academic. What's the actual practical, Aiden? What's the practical outcome if neither are eligible for the city of refuge, according to the Meiri versus the Ritva? What's the actual practical outcome?
If neither was eligible for the city of refuge,
Yeah, because
then
they're holding in
surely they.
different positions.
Sorry, I didn't get that part.
They're holding different positions, the Ritva and the Meiri. So it's not just an intellectual or academic debate. What is the consequence for the perpetrator, according to the Ritva versus the Meiri? What's the actual practical difference?
Um, I don't know.
Okay, so the bottom line is whomever said it's bordering on gross negligence, which is the Meiri, that person doesn't go to the city of exile because they don't deserve the protection of the city of refuge, which is the same city, and therefore the family members of those that are deceased can exact revenge and kill him. So he doesn't get the protection, nor does he get the atonement, because what he did is bordering on almost deliberate, and therefore he doesn't deserve to have atonement in this world, and he's going to have a big, big problem in the next world. That's according to the Meiri. According to the Ritva, is that this was a complete accident, and therefore the person doesn't go to the city of refuge because they don't have to get protection from the Goal Adam, because the Sanhedrin would rule it a complete accident, and the person can carry on with their life, and they've got no reason to atone for something that was accidental. You get it? Bottom line. Now,
Okay.
as far as the Rambam is concerned, interesting. He said that if you hit your right target in terms of direction and you overshoot, full culpability, bordering on the deliberate, because you were dead accurate. The only issue is that you can't determine that you're gonna fall short 2 meters short of hitting him in the skull. How do you know that? If you're in the right direction, how do you know that? It's a different level of expertise. So if you're accurate enough to aim in that person's direction, there's full culpability. But if you're such a retarded thrower that instead of throwing left, your wrist goes to the right and you kill somebody, the Rambam says that that is almost completely accidental. Do you see how he takes a part of the Ritva and part of the Meiri? Bottom line. Okay, let's move on. That was a quick summary of yesterday. I don't think a 5-minute summary is the end of the world. Now, so where's this found? The source of this was in Shmot, which is Exodus chapter 21, verse 13. That's where you can find this issue about projectiles and culpability, okay? Now, just one last thing is lastly, when we look at the brisa in this verse from Devarim, chapter 19, verse 5, the Torah is basically setting forward the accidental death that had a certain degree of negligence at which a person perfectly goes to exile. Okay? So it says, look, and whoever comes with his fellow into the forest. So basically, by choosing the example, the Torah teaches that this guideline for the type of situation which exile is called for are drawn from the characteristics of a forest. What does that mean? Forest, it's like going almost to a public park. It's a place where both the perpetrator and the victim have a right to enter. So if there's any area that is not private but public domain, and you do an act which could end up creating damage, you'd be subject to exile. Okay? But we're saying it has nothing to do with taking out a gun and firing at an animal and hitting a human being, because then not only is the intent to kill, but it's very dangerous. It's very different to taking out your axe, chopping wood, and having that axe handle separate from the top metal shaft, the shaft separating from the top metal part of the axe. At which case, the reason why exile is there was a degree of negligence. You could have checked your equipment before, but further to which it was a minor degree of negligence, but certainly not gross, and therefore atonement is for you if you caused it and you deserved protection. Does that make sense in terms of the quintessential case? And we can move on. All makes sense. Very straightforward.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Gemara poses a question. It's got this argument now with Rav Abahu, and he asked Rav Yochanan. He said, okay, so because he's still worried about this whole issue of a downward motion to perpetuate an upward motion. So he's saying to Rav Yochanan, okay, there's a person, he's climbing a ladder, right? And the rung broke from underfoot and it fell on somebody and killed somebody. What is the law? So, in other words, under such circumstances, do you consider that's a death resulting from an upward motion? Because what's the person trying to do? Climb up the ladder. And therefore, that would exempt the person from exile. Or is the death seen as resulting from a downward motion because the pressure of the climber's foot on the rung was in a downward direction, and therefore the person would be sent to exile? So, one important thing to realize here is the whole crux of the matter is whether the direction of the motion is going to be judged from the perspective of the person who killed, and that person's going upwards, or from the perspective of the instrument of death. In other words, the rung traveled downwards and clonked the person over the head. And this was brought by Rashi. That's the bottom line. Now, guys, I just want you to know that this can't be confused with the case in the Mishnah, because in the case of the Mishnah, a person was climbing downward on the ladder, and what happened? As he was climbing downward, his body fell on the victim. So when your body is the instrument of death, then the direction is what's going to determine culpability. Okay, because you're clearly going down, and you have to exercise a greater degree of caution. Here we're saying it's a case of a person going up, but the rung collapsed under his weight, and therefore that rung, which was an instrument separate from his body, came down and cracked the person's skull open, and they died. So do we judge by the person or by the instrument? And the person's going in an upward motion, and he was ascending, but the rungs slipped and fell beneath him. So that's what we basically want to know. Now, any questions before we go on, guys? It'll become fairly clear if you don't have any pressing questions. You're all good. All right, I'm assuming you'll stop me if you have questions. So Rav Yochanan says to Rav Abahu, look, all you've done is you've touched upon the previously established principle of a downward motion made to facilitate an upward motion. And the Brisa taught that he's exiled. So what does Rav Yochanan basically hold at? Is that it doesn't matter what you intend to do, it matters what you've done. And therefore, he doesn't separate body and instrument in this case because your foot collapsed. And therefore, it was at the exact second of impact or causing the impact, the catalyst. It was a downward motion, even if you intended to go up. And Rav Abahu doesn't agree with him. He said, look, the Mishnah stated this rule. Whoever killed inadvertently while engaged in a downward motion is exiled. But if he was killed while he was engaged in an upward motion, he's not exiled. So it's got to be that the second part of the rule, which he was engaged in a motion that was not downward, this has to add to a particular case of the Mishnah. Otherwise, it's not going to add any new principle. So what does he say? Look, as a rule, the Mishnah's way of teaching is to state a ruling in context of a specific case, right? And then it leaves it up to the student to abstract the underlying legal principle from the particulars of a ruling. The Mishnah doesn't generally give a whole lot of specific rulings and then summarize it with a general rule. It doesn't work like that because then you don't need the specifics. The general purpose about having a specific case is it's got certain common features with other cases, as well as cases that, well, characteristics that are unique to that particular example. So they're common principles and they're specific principles. And you have to extrapolate it from that one particular case. So we're saying, well, what do you do in this in this particular case? So so he says, look, how does Rav Yochanan view it? Because if so, it's contradicting the Mishnah. Why? Because Rav Abahu said, listen, it adds that the exemption from exile includes cases like this, in which, okay, you broke a rung during the ascent, and the rung fell and killed somebody, but it means that the person was in an upward motion. So Rav Abahu says you've got to separate the difference between the instrument and the person. It's different if you want to say that the person goes downward in order to go upward. Instrument and the person are the same. In this case, they're different. So he's saying, well, the whole brisa is brought to bring something added to the Mishnah. Otherwise, what was the point? So Rav Yochanan says, listen, there's a counter argument that I've got to you, is that if you look at the first part of the Mishnah, what does it rule? He said, look, it basically rules that whoever kills inadvertently while engaged in a downward motion must go to exile. And what does this add specifically? In other words, since the deduction is based on the principle that the rule must be including something that's not already understood, you might as well just deduce from the first part of the rule is opposite. In other words, there's exile in such a situation. So in order to explain the point of the brisa, it must include both parts of the rule, and that is about the instrument and the person itself. So Rav Yochanan said, look, what does it do? It adds a more complicated case. In other words, it doesn't just talk about an upward and downward motion. We're learning this case of a butcher in the brisa, and what we're going to see is what happens if you have compound movements. In other words, it's a movement in sequential events, but Rav Yochanan still holds, by the way, that how do you judge it? The actual action, not what your follow sequential action was going to achieve, but what was actually caused at that time. How does Rav Abahu hold? Is that he obviously can't argue with the Mishnah, because if you're in a downward motion in order to get up, but it's the person that's the instrument, you can't argue with that. But if it is perhaps a rung off a ladder, then in that particular case, you going upward, it happens to give way under your foot. Now, obviously, we're going to go through a case that there might be negligence. In other words, we're not talking about a case if the ladder was rotten, because if the ladder was rotten and that's why the rung collapsed underneath, whose fault is that? It's the culpability of the perpetrator, meaning that's bordering on gross negligence. And that's why I wouldn't go to exile. So to go to exile with a downward motion it might not even say that if the ladder itself was damaged to that degree, that would be eligible to go down to exile. He might not go to exile, but not for the reason that you think, but because there's gross negligence. So all we are saying here is Rav Abahu discerns the difference between the instrument of death and the person's direction or of ascension, whereas Rav Yochanan turns around and says basically whatever action you did at the time, if you descend in order to ascend, that's what it's judged on. So what's this case of the butcher and the pricer? Now, up until now, it's been simple. Wait till I go through this. This has been a headache. I finally worked it out, but I had to read it quite a few times when I read it a few weeks ago, and then I had to listen to a share on different aspects of it. But I'm going to just give you the bottom line. Okay, so you've got a butcher, right? And he's chopping meat, and he inadvertently kills somebody with his meat cleaver. So the Gemara cites 4 different rulings regarding this case, and apparently they all seem contradictory on superficial basis. So there's one brisa. The first brisa, what does it state? Guys, if the mishap occurred while he was moving his arm forward, the butcher is liable to exile. Okay? So in other words, I don't know if you can see my motion here. If he's just going forward, he's liable to exile. So that's what you're reading on first glance. Then there's another brisa that says, okay, so that first brisa, if he's moving his arm forward, he's liable to exile. If he's moving it backwards, he's exempt from exile. There's a second brisa, and it states, if he's moving it backward, he's liable to exile, but if he's moving it forward, he's exempt from exile. So we have a brisa with opposite rules. Okay? Then there's a third brisa that states whether it occurred moving forward or backward, the butcher is liable to exile. In other words, both the forward and backward movement, there's a liability. And the fourth brisa that says whether it occurred, whether the butcher was moving his meat cleaver and arm forward or backwards, he's exempt from exile. So it's very difficult to reconcile this. But yet the Gemara says there's actually no contradiction, because what you've got to see it in the big perspective. And it's referring to different parts of a butcher's swing. So basically, what we are saying is it's about velocity. So what do we mean by velocity? Is you can cut a piece of meat like that, but you're not going to get very far. So there's like, what do you call it? This Bruce Lee nunchuck story. I think you've seen him play table tennis or do a couple of these things with nunchuckers. I did use nunchuckers when I was in martial arts, and I knocked myself unconscious and had to get an MRI. So it wasn't for me. But the bottom line of it is it's this motion where you're going forward, going back, and going to the sides, etc. Because what you want to do is create momentum. And the reason why you want to create momentum is you want it successfully done in one chop, because in those days there was no machinery. So you had to build up a bit of leverage. So you can think of it like an archer and a bow, that if you want to send an arrow and you've got tensioning on the bowstring and you release it, it's the pulling of the back that's going to ensure it goes forward. Okay? So the bottom line is the reason it's not contradictory is what happens is it has 5 parts to it. Okay? Firstly, beginning with the cleaver in front of him. Okay? So he lifts up the cleaver and he first lowers it. And then he raises it back towards his shoulders, because if it's midway, there's not a lot of momentum moving it back. So he's actually lowering it in order to get a full stretch upwards. And then he continues down behind his back. And then he accelerates forward. And he brings the meat cleaver above his shoulder. And then finally down on the chopping block. Okay? So the reason why there's all these motions and all these brises is it's not different activities. It's preparatory to have one single clean cut. So if we examine the first brisa, it's basically resulting in a forward motion, but it's not a normal forward motion as you would understand it. It's not this. It's forward downward. Okay? So therefore, if it's forward, but you're going downward at the same time, you're liable for exile. That would understand the first brisa. And then obviously if you're going backwards and you're going upwards, there's no eligibility, but don't focus on the forward and the forward and the backwards. It's the direction it's going up or down when it's going forward or backwards. Okay, so that's what you've got to bear in mind. In the second brisa, it refers to the mishap during the upswing forward and the downswing backward. So in other words, as you forward swing, as you forward swinging, you're swinging up, and then you bring in the cleaver behind you. Now, even though you're bringing it behind you, it's in a downward motion, and that's what creates the liability. Does that make sense, guys? It's pretty straightforward. And then the third and fourth brisa is that when you draw your cleaver back onto your shoulder and the motion is backward and also downward, he's therefore exiled. So basically, what you have to focus on when it's talking about this upward, downward motion, forward, backward, is it doesn't matter whether your meat cleaver is going forward or backwards. The only thing that matters is the direction when you're getting momentum upward or downward, because that could be either. So that's what it depends on, the actual direction of the motion. Does everybody understand before we go on? Lance?
No, look, I think this whole argument is crazy because it's really one action. The guy can't think or only concentrate when he's bringing forward. He's concentrating during the whole motion, forward and backward, backward and forward. It's not as though now you think, now you don't, now you think, now you don't. It's one action. So why is he liable only when it's going forward or only when it's going backward? It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, so let me clear it up for you. It's a good question Lance is asking. So you would go with Rav Abahu probably as opposed to Rav Yochanan. So Rav Yochanan's bottom line position is, irrespective of your broader intent, anything involved in a downward action, you're liable for exile. Rav Abahu feels the same way. However, sometimes if the instrument is separate from the person, and it's not with the case of the butcher, only Rav Yochanan brought the case of the butcher. The only case that Rav Abahu says that in an upward motion that you're not liable is if you have a separation between the instrument and the person. Otherwise, he agrees with Rav Yochanan. But this case of the butcher, Lance, when you read these four brises, in one it says if you're going forward, there's liability. Other one, brisa says if you're going forward, there's no liability. The other one, if you're going back, there's liability. And the other one, you're not liable. Okay? And the bottom line of it, and it's talking about behind your back, forward, etc., etc. The bottom line of the Gemara said, don't worry about these contradicting brises, because the bottom line is, if you're bringing the axe back for momentum, if you're bringing it back but in an upward motion, there's no liability. If somebody happens to stick their head above you and you tonk them going upwards, it's not your fault. If you're going backwards and you crack them on the top of the head, it's your fault. So when you're going in an upward direction, whether you're going forward or backwards, there's no liability. The minute you're going downward, it doesn't matter whether your direction is forward or back. The downward ends up being culpable for exile. So that's how the four different brises are reconciled. It has nothing to do with forward or backward motion. It's when you're getting backwards to get leverage. Are you going in and upward? No liability. But if you're putting the axe that way, there is liability. When you're pulling it forward and down, there is liability for exile. If you're going forward and up, there's no liability for exile. So it's not about the forward and backward motion, it's about the up-down. That's how it's reconciled. Does that make sense? And then we're done. It's going according to the Mishnah.
Damon.
Yeah. Just hang on.
But what happens if the oak... Oh, sorry, okay.
Lance, does it make sense?
Not really.
Listen,
Yeah.
the Mishnah says you're culpable.
Sleep on it.
Pardon?
I'll sleep on it. Basically, look, understand that there's that circular motion and part of the circular arc, some of it's down.
So whatever's down, whether it's forward, whether it's forward or back, whatever's down is exile, whatever's up, there's no exile. That's how to reconcile it. Those four brises. That's what the Gemara says. Give it thought. Yeah, Kev?